Hi, this is Josh Bycer from GameWisdom.com. Hope you enjoyed this critical thought, a detailed discussion on game design, and be sure to subscribe and you can pitch future critical thought topics. Alright, for today's critical thought, this is going to be continuing my discussion about lengths and keeping games going. On the previous industry insight, we talked about why do developers or publishers like sequels so much, and how long can you really sustain a series for? For today's critical thought, we're going to talk about game length. One of those great philosophical debates that people go up to mountaintop monasteries to ask wise gurus about. When it comes to game length, as we've talked about in previous critical thoughts, there is no predefined length for how long a game should be. I play games that are 30 minutes long. I play games that have gone into the hundreds of hours of play there. And there is no right answer to it. But there are some things to keep in mind when it comes to, I guess, the overall length of designing your game or what you should consider when you're building your title. And there are several different factors, and I can already have a feeling this is going to be a long critical thought. Now, at the most, I guess, high level when it comes to discussion, there is a simple discussion of price versus time. And this is one of those very hard topics to talk about, especially with the video game industry and the issues of the race to the bottom and, of course, game devaluation. When we looked at video games, at least over the last decade, there's been this common thought that for a $60 game, you should get at least 8 to 10 hours of gameplay. Now, before we go on, one other point I want to bring up, we're going to be ignoring multiplayer focused titles or games with multiplayer modes for this discussion. The reason is that multiplayer design is in of itself its own unique beast and has its own considerations to go over. But when it comes to a single player title, that 8 to 10 hours was considered the usual standard for most action based titles. Stuff like Uncharted, God of War, Call of Duty's campaign, and the like. And then, of course, we had exceptions with RPGs. There's always been that 60 to 80 hour mark for games like the Final Fantasy titles. But typically, when we think about price and time, the more money to put onto a game, the more we expect out of it. And that leads into some very interesting discussions at the AAA layer. As we talked about when it comes to sequels or experimenting, most publishers are not fans of this. They want, again, something that they can easily market and something that is a known. And this is why that 8 to 10 hour mark was considered an important standard. When over, I guess, the last few years, we saw the issue with The Order for the PS4, I believe, that I heard only had like a 3 to 5 hour long campaign. And that kind of rubbed people the wrong way. And like we just said, when people are spending money, especially at full retail, they kind of want to get their money's worth. But the interesting part about this, or at least talking things from a time and money debate, is that we really have seen things go all over the board. I've played $10 games for 50, 60 hours at this point with stuff like The Binding of Isaac. I've spent, oh god, I can't even think how much money I've spent on, or time spent on Left 4 Dead. I have a friend who spent easily over several thousand hours into Team Fortress 2 by now, and so on. A few nights ago, we did a Let's Play of Oath Match, which is a $5 match 3 puzzle quest kind of game. And when I started, I was thinking, well, it's only $5. Maybe I'll get like an hour or two out of it. And then I saw like the campaign map. It was like this big, and like these little dots here represent the different areas to explore. So it felt like it was going to be a very long game. And for those of you who managed to stay awake for the Twitch or the YouTube stream, thank you for attending. But from there, we can start talking a little bit more about what kind of, or how the design affords the amount of time spent. And there are several big parts of this. When it comes to designing a video game, we did an earlier critical thought about unique versus generalized mechanics. A general mechanic is something that can be extended or grown out very easily. Platforming, RPG mechanics, even something like racing and first-person shooting. Unique mechanics are usually something that is tied specifically to a specialized game, and it's not something that's easily replicated. So some examples would be the portal gun, the various tools in the Talos principle. Trying to think of some other good examples, and there's nothing coming to me. But the point is, the more unique your mechanics or your game systems are, the more you're limited in terms of coming up with ways to challenge the player with it. And with that point, it's important to talk about kind of how we can, I guess, categorize video games in terms of, I guess, content to mechanics. And when I was thinking about this earlier, there are three very broad categories. We have games that have a narrative or story that frame the experience. As in, this is a game that has a set beginning, middle, and end with how the story goes. And this could be anything as simple as the campaigns in Call of Duty and Doom, to something more emotional like Gone Home, The Last of Us, and so on. Basically, in these games, you as the designer have a pretty good idea of what your story is going to be or what you're going to tell, and then it's up to you to fill this gap between the beginning and the middle, or beginning and the end, in terms of gameplay. Now, having the narrative frame the story, or narrative frame the gameplay, also makes it a little bit easier in terms of defining the overall length and what you can get out of it. For instance, if our game story takes place in the Amazon rainforest, then we know we can't have a section that takes place on the moon, or travel back in time to the colonial era, or anything like that. And in these kinds of narrative-driven games, it's more about, again, filling in the gaps with gameplay while still moving the story along. And that's one of the big challenges when it comes to titles like this. Because gamers are very good at picking up when things become filler. Such as, oh no, every door I come to just so happens to be locked, and now I have to go all the way over there to get the key. But wait, that key's behind a locked wall, or just so happens that there's debris blocking, so now we have to go back all the way over there and get it. Or the ever-popular tactic of repeating boss fights for no reason. There have been games where they just throw repeated bosses in there, and there's no explanation. Now, in these kinds of games, it is possible to remove or add content, depending upon at what point does it factor in. For instance, if we have, let's say, a story beat here, and then a story beat right here, then the space in between can be whatever the hell we want. As long as the story part is not changed, we can put in more areas to explore, or we can take some out. Now, the second category of games is where the story is simply the guideline or setting the stage for the gameplay, and then everything else is focused on the mechanics and the design. These would be games like Mario, Soulsborne. Again, this is one of those things. Oh, XCOM would be an example, where you have a story, there is an established beginning, middle, and end over here, but everything that happens in between is completely up for grabs. For instance, when we talk about Mario, again, we know what the beginning and the end of a Mario game is. Bowser kidnaps Peach, Mario saves Peach. But everything in between can be however long or short as we want. If Nintendo wanted to make a Mario game that has 5 worlds or 500 worlds of levels, it's up to them, and the story is not going to be impacted in the slightest. With a game like XCOM, we have a specific end condition. In the latest XCOM, or Enemy Unknown, we take on the alien mothership. We have an established beginning. But everything that goes between those 2 points is up to our choices and what happens in the game. In these titles, it's more about how much you can get out of your systems and the mechanics at play. Again, we've seen games, especially with RPG mechanics, that can stretch things out to some amazing extent. Because again, as long as there are numbers in existence, you can keep going. We can have games that have level 9,999 like Disgaea, or we go even more. And then there's of course expansions and DLC that can add more to it. As long as people are willing to keep playing, you can keep extending it out. But there are limits, and we all have our own specific limit when it comes to games like this. For instance, when I play Diablo 3, I can't get past like Torment 5 or 6. When I start to get to that point, it just feels like the game becomes a drag. But I've had friends who've gone all the way to the end for a season's journey. But that's kind of where we get into that interesting debate of just how much you can stretch mechanics. And that also goes back to what I was saying a few minutes ago regarding unique versus general mechanics. When it comes to unique systems, there is an inherent limit. With a game like Portal, the portal gun is an amazing game mechanic. It's something that really allows action puzzle design. But it's also one of those things like having the power of Superman, that it becomes very hard to create interesting and unique challenges. If I can simply teleport from any 2 points, then how can you keep coming up with a variety or a varied number of situations? Now with games like this is where it becomes easier to cut or add content as per the designer's discretion. With Super Mario, for instance, or the Mario games in particular, it doesn't matter how many worlds are between Mario and Saving Peach, because the story doesn't really factor into that. So it comes down to quality. If a level doesn't meet Nintendo's standard, taking it out is not going to destroy your story. Likewise, if you have something that's really amazing, putting it in at any spot of the game is not going to alter things as well. And I am very sure, as I'm sitting here talking to you, that Nintendo has probably cut levels in any of the Mario games if they were not up to the code or the standard that they wanted. Now, with that said, the third category of games and where things get very tricky in terms of knowing just how long to make a game are open-ended or sandbox titles. These are games where there are no predefined end. You can play them as long as you want, for how many hours you want, go into them. You can build whatever you want. And again, the examples are huge. Minecraft, Subnautica, Factorio. Again, my brain is starting to fail me because it's overloading with so many examples. But these are games where the interconnection of systems means that as long as you come up with interesting mechanics or systems that can connect to each other, you can keep building this game. You can keep growing it to however big you want it. And we have seen developers go this route in the past, especially someone like Paradox Software or Paradox Interactive, the makers of games like Crusader Kings, Europa Universalis, Stellaris, and so on. Now with these titles, it is very tricky to know just how much you want to add to these games. Because again, this is not like a linear title. If your story fits within 8 levels, well, you know you have 8 levels to design. With something like Mario, if we have 30 worlds that we really love and we want to put in this game, there's our limit. But how do you come up with a limit for something that's non-linear? At what point do you say that your game is done and people will get their money's worth? Again, going back to the beginning, this is one of those great questions, and there is no easy answer to this. If I had one and I could explain it to people, I would be rich right now. And the challenge of this, again, is that every game is different. And as game designers, there's always that allure to go big. And we're at 14 minutes in, and if we explore that topic, we'll be here for another 30. But when it comes to open-ended or systems-driven games, it becomes very hard to separate what's the core content versus what's the supplemental or ancillary. And this goes back to one of our most important critical thoughts, defining your core gameplay loop, the foundation or architecture of your game. If you can't figure that out, you will never have a successful game. And when it comes to figuring out just how much to do into your game or how much your game should be, understanding what your core gameplay loop is critical. On several occasions, I've spoken to Chris Park from Arkin Games, who have made some very systems-rich designs, almost on par with the stuff from Paradox Interactive. Games like AI Wars, The Last Federation, Skyward Collapse, which if you haven't played that game, it's a very interesting deconstruction of turn-based strategy. And I've spoken to Chris about this several times. When you have games that are such a interconnectedness of systems that everything feeds off of each other to create something greater than the sum of its parts, how do you know when you're done? How do you know that having 5 game systems is it? Why don't we have a few more? And again, with something like The Last Federation, or what we see with Crusader Kings and Europa Universalis, the sky is really the limit. As long as you come up with ideas that work within the confines of the design, you can keep going. And I bet it would be very tempting for Paradox to just spend like 5-10 years working on one of their grand strategy games. But that is one of the biggest challenges of game development. Because again, as we've said, the longer you spend working on a game, the more of a risk it is to earn back that money and hopefully turn a profit. When I spoke with Chris Park, one of the big changes to their design philosophy at Arkin over the years was, instead of going big with these massive ideas that take 3-4 years to make, they wanted to make more squared down games. Something that could take maybe 6 months to a year and be tightly refined to the point that you get a very amazing core gameplay loop, and that's it. No ancillary content, no subsystems, because Chris wanted to see if this mechanic worked, or if this system was good enough that people wanted to play it. And of course, I am sure he has files and folders full of what ifs and expansion worthy content for every one of his games. But it doesn't make sense to add that stuff in if your if the base game doesn't sell. And this is where the idea of supplemental versus incremental content comes in, or what it means to expand your game. And we've talked about this before, and if I get into a full discussion on this, we'll be here again for probably 60 more minutes at this point. But incremental content is content that specifically adds length to your game. If I have a 5-level game and I create a 2-level DLC, we have a 7-level game. Very simple there, I know. Supplemental content doesn't add length to your game, but makes each singular run more varied. And this is typically seen in roguelikes and open-ended games. Stuff like The Binding of Isaac, XCOM, I'm sure Factorial will at some point will probably have more content like this. The point is, if a single playthrough, or let's take The Binding of Isaac, a single Binding of Isaac run, if you know what you're doing, probably 20 to 30 minutes if you get really lucky with item combinations and level generation. What the content that they've added with expansions does is you're still going to spend about 20 to 30 minutes on a single run. But there's going to be new stuff to change things up. There's going to be new items to find, new floor variations, new bosses, and so on. With the Enemy Within expansion to XCOM, what they did was add a lot more content while still keeping the start and end points the same. We know how XCOM game starts and ends, but in between we get new terror missions, new gear to equip, the new enemy faction whose name escapes me, and so on. So this is a way of adding content to the game without adding length. And like we said, if you can do this and enhance your game systems like this, it can add value and can keep people coming back, especially for games that are replayable. And I mentioned them a few minutes ago, but one of the kings of supplemental content is Paradox Interactive. They have really gotten good when it comes to adding more content to their games. And again, when they release any one of their titles on launch, you can play them just fine. You can play an entire game of Crusader Kings or Europa Universalis. I think my mouth is starting to slur there. But the expansions or the DLC that gets added adds in new systems, it adds new factions with rules attached to them, it could add new conditions to win, new researches, and so on. So again, the average length of these games, which is still on the long side of things, doesn't change all that much. But what you're going to be doing in them does change. And with that said, there is one final point when it comes to understanding how long a game should be or how much to work on it. And this is one of the more serious points. I've talked to many developers over the last few years, especially those who have gone through early access. And one of the big questions that I kind of throw them for a loop for when I ask them is, how did you know when your game is done? How did you know it's time to go from early access to 1.0? And I hate to rain on a few developers' parades, but I have to say it. One of the more popular answers I hear is, when I run out of money. And while that is joking and it's funny, it's not a good answer. Like we've said, when it comes to designing a video game, it's important to understand the goalposts, to understand at what point do I say my game is done. And like we've talked about over the last 20 minutes, every game is different. If we're working on a single player, narrative driven or narrative focused game, then it's over when the story's done. If we're talking about a game that the story is simply a guideline, then that's different. It can be done when you run out of content. But if you keep adding content, then how do you get done? And again, when it comes to open-ended and nonlinear titles, my goodness, we can spend even more time on that one. But the important point, and kind of what to tie this all together, goes back to the core gameplay loop. That should always be your marker, your guidepost. Everything has to flow or extrapolate from your core gameplay loop. If something has no bearings on it whatsoever, then that kind of content is just ancillary to the experience. If you're making a turn-based strategy game, and you have to decide whether to work on enhancing your combat system or allowing players to dress up the characters in different clothing, what's going to be more important to making sure your game works? And it's very important to be able to break down your mechanics and what you have planned into a hierarchy of what's vital to your game. What are the elements that if you don't have in your game, you don't have a title? And again, I can't answer that for you. It all depends on what your game is and what your core gameplay loop is. Now, that doesn't mean you can't think of additional content. Again, there is always room for expansions, DLC, supplemental and incremental content. But if you want to get to that point, you need to establish a foundation first. And figuring out just how far you want to stretch your game's design and your mechanics is a big part of that. And we're about 23 minutes in. I could sit here and probably talk about this for who knows how long, but we're going to wrap things up here. And specifically for this topic, if you're a developer out there who wants me to expand on anything that we've talked about in another critical thought, let me know in the comments below, because like I said, this is one of those grand mysteries of game design. And I have one question that I want to ask you folks to end things on. When you're deciding what games to play, what works better for you? A 5-hour game that is amazing through and through, or a 15-hour game that has some padding and repeated content in it? For me, I'm at the point where I think less is more. I'd rather play a 10-hour game that's amazing versus 30 hours where I'm bored or I'm being frustrated for 20 of it. It's why I've gotten a little bit tired of, the Final Fantasy formula of having 60 to 80 hours of game to play, and a lot of it can be considered filler. But let me know what you think in the comments below, and we're going to wrap things up here. So thank you so much for sticking through one of these extra long critical thoughts. If you're new and you enjoy things, be sure to like and subscribe. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And check back daily for more great discussions of design here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. And if you have an idea for a future topic, definitely let me know. But until next time, have a great night. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoy it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and of course share with your friends. It always helps out. For daily posts on all manner of game design and industry topics, check out game-wisdom.com. To support the site and everything that I do, be sure to check out the Patreon campaign. If we can hit goals, it will mean more content for everyone to enjoy, and I'll be able to support myself and my household. If you want to follow me, you can find me on Twitter at GWBycer for updates throughout the day and random thoughts from me. And lastly, you can find me on Twitch right over there at GWBycer for daily streams most nights around 10 Eastern. Thanks again for watching the video, and be sure to check out more great content coming to the Game Wisdom channel real soon.